James walked deeper into the forest, the early morning light casting long shadows across the forest floor. The events of the previous night haunted him, but he pushed forward, driven by a strange compulsion that he couldn't quite understand. Every step he took seemed to pull him further into the unknown, into a darkness that was both terrifying and oddly familiar. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that seemed to cling to him as he walked. James's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the voice he had heard in the night. It had sounded so much like Rachel, but how could that be possible? She had left him, and yet the whispering had been real. He could still hear it, echoing in his mind like a haunting melody. As he walked, he noticed something strange about the forest. The deeper he went, the darker it became, even though the sun was climbing higher in the sky. The light seemed to bend and twist around the trees, creating shadows that moved and shifted as if alive. James's unease grew with every step, but something kept him moving forward, a pull that he couldn't resist. It was as if the forest itself was calling to him, drawing him deeper into its depths. After what felt like hours of walking, James came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old abandoned cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing but the twisted shapes of the surrounding trees. James felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the cabin. It was out of place, a relic of a time long past, and yet there was something about it that felt eerily familiar. He approached it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As he reached the front door, he noticed something strange. Carved into the wood was a single word: Rachel. The letters were jagged and uneven, as if they had been scratched into the wood with trembling hands. James's breath caught in his throat as he reached out to touch the carving. The wood was cold under his fingers, sending a shock of cold through his body. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be? How could Rachel's name be here in this place? A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, rattling the branches of the trees and sending a shiver down his spine. The door to the cabin creaked open slightly, as if inviting him inside. James hesitated, every instinct in his body screaming at him to turn back, to run as far away from this place as possible. But something stronger than fear held him in place, a need to know, to understand what was happening. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from the cracks in the wooden walls. Dust hung heavy in the air and the floorboards creaked under James's weight. The cabin was small, just one room with a single window covered in grime. The only furniture was an old wooden table and a chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust. James felt a sense of unease as he looked around the cabin. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, abandoned and forgotten for years. And yet, there was something about it that felt oddly familiar, as if he had been here before. As he walked further into the cabin, he noticed something lying on the table. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and covered in dust. He picked it up and wiped away the dust with his sleeve. The photograph was of a woman standing in front of the cabin. She was smiling, her face turned slightly towards the camera. James felt his heart skip a beat as he realized who the woman was: Rachel. But something was wrong. The woman in the photograph looked like Rachel, but she was different. Her hair was longer, her clothes old-fashioned, and her eyes. There was something off about her eyes. They were cold, empty, devoid of the warmth and love he had once known. James's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be possible? How could Rachel be in this photograph, standing in front of this cabin? Suddenly, a shadow moved in the corner of his eye. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The cabin was empty, but the air felt thick with something unseen, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He put the photograph down and took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But as he did, he heard it again, the whispering voice coming from somewhere deep within the cabin. "James?" He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice was closer now, clearer, as if the speaker was standing right behind him. He could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. "James, why did you leave me?" James backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice was unmistakable. It was Rachel, but it was twisted, warped by something dark and malevolent. He stumbled back against the wall, his hands searching for something to hold on to. But the cabin was empty, save for the photograph on the table and the growing sense of dread that filled the air. "James, come to me." The whisper grew louder, more insistent, as if the voice was inside his head, echoing through his mind. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, suffocating him. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway of the cabin. It was a woman, her hair long and dark, her face hidden in shadow. But James knew who it was. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching him, its presence cold and menacing. James felt a surge of fear, but also something else, a deep, overwhelming sadness. He had loved Rachel once, had given her everything, only to have it all ripped away. And now, here she was, standing before him, but twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. He took a step towards the figure, his heart aching with a mix of fear and longing. But as he did, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the empty doorway and the oppressive silence of the cabin. James fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as tears filled his eyes. He had come here to escape the pain of Rachel's betrayal, but all he had found was more pain, more suffering. But deep down, he knew he couldn't turn back now. Whatever was happening, whatever dark force was at work in this forest, he had to see it through. He had to find out the truth, even if it meant facing the darkness that lurked within his own heart. The days blurred together as James continued his journey deeper into the forest. He no longer knew how long he had been walking, how many nights he had spent in the oppressive darkness of the woods. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadowed paths that led him ever deeper into its heart. The encounters with the ghostly figure of Rachel became more frequent. Every night, she appeared to him, sometimes in the distance, sometimes close enough that he could feel her icy breath on his skin. Her whispers grew more insistent, more desperate, as if she were trying to tell him something, but the words were always just out of reach, lost in the echoing void of his mind. James's sleep became restless, plagued by nightmares that left him gasping for breath, his body drenched in sweat. In his dreams, he was always running from something dark and formless that chased him through the endless forest. But no matter how fast he ran, it was always right behind him, its presence suffocating and inescapable. He began to lose track of time, the days blending into nights, the nights into days. The forest twisted and warped around him, its paths shifting like a living, breathing entity. Sometimes he would walk in circles, ending up in the same place he had started, as if the forest itself were toying with him, leading him deeper into its clutches. But even as his mind and body began to break down, he couldn't stop. The pull of the forest was too strong, the need to uncover the truth too overwhelming. He knew that whatever awaited him at the end of this journey, it would be the answer to everything. The answer to Rachel's betrayal, to the ghostly whispers, to the dark force that haunted his every step. One night, as he set up camp in a small clearing, he noticed something different. The air was colder, the darkness deeper, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The feeling of being watched, which had been a constant companion on his journey, was stronger than ever. As he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, he heard the whisper again. But this time, it wasn't Rachel's voice. It was something else, something darker and more sinister. The voice was low and guttural, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. James's heart raced as the voice grew louder, filling the clearing with its ominous presence. The trees around him seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the light of the fire and plunging him into darkness. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing there, nothing but the oppressive darkness and the growing sense of dread that filled the air. The voice grew louder, more insistent, as if it were coming from inside his own mind. James clutched his head, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was everywhere, suffocating him, driving him to the brink of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The clearing was silent once more, the darkness lifting slightly as the fire flickered back to life. James stood there, trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But as the fear began to subside, he noticed something strange, a path leading out of the clearing, one that hadn't been there before. The path was narrow and winding, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. But there was something about it that called to him, something that told him it was the way he had to go. With a heavy heart and a mind filled with dread, James picked up his belongings and began to walk down the path. He didn't know where it would lead, but he knew that it was the only way forward, the only way to find the answers he so desperately sought. As he walked, the forest grew darker, the trees closing in around him. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the shadows seemed to move and shift as he passed. But James pressed on, driven by a force stronger than fear, stronger than the darkness that surrounded him. And as he walked, he heard the whisper again, but this time, it was different. The voice was softer, more gentle, as if it were leading him, guiding him down the path. James! He followed the voice, his heart pounding in his chest as the path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the forest. The darkness grew thicker, more oppressive, but he kept moving, driven by the need to uncover the truth. And then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, the path opened up into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching up towards the sky. The tree was massive, its trunk twisted and scarred, as if it had seen countless years of suffering and pain. But it wasn't the tree that caught James's attention. It was what lay beneath it. There, at the base of the tree, was a small, weathered gravestone. The stone was cracked and covered in moss, the letters faded with time. But as James knelt down to brush away the dirt and leaves, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. The name carved into the stone was one he recognized all too well: Rachel. James's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the gravestone. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could this be? How could Rachel be buried here, in this place? Suddenly, the whisper came again, louder this time, more urgent. "James, come to me." He looked up, and there, standing beneath the ancient tree, was the ghostly figure of Rachel. But this time, she was different. Her face was no longer twisted and dark, but soft and sad, her eyes filled with a deep, unending sorrow. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, I'm so sorry." James felt a surge of emotion, fear, anger, sadness, all mixing together in a torrent of confusion. But above all, there was a deep, aching sense of loss, a feeling that he had lost something precious, something that could never be replaced. He reached out to her, but as he did, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the darkness of the forest. Her voice lingered in the air, echoing in his mind as she disappeared. "Forgive me." And then she was gone. James fell to his knees, his heart heavy with grief and regret. He had come here searching for answers, but all he had found was more pain, more suffering. The truth he had sought was as elusive as the ghostly figure that had haunted him through the forest. But deep down, he knew that this was the end. The path he had walked had led him here, to this moment, to the realization that some things could never be undone, that some wounds could never truly heal. As he knelt there, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, casting a soft, golden glow over the clearing. The darkness of the forest began to lift, and with it, the weight of the past that had haunted him for so long. James took a deep breath, his mind finally clear, his heart heavy, but at peace. He knew that he couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring back the love he had lost. But he could move forward, could find a way to live with the pain, to accept the darkness and the light that made up his life. And as he stood up and turned to leave the clearing, he knew that he would never forget the journey he had taken, the lessons he had learned, and the ghostly figure of Rachel that had led him to this place of understanding. He walked back down the path, the forest no longer dark and menacing, but alive with the light of a new day. The shadows that had once tormented him were gone, replaced by the soft, warm glow of the morning sun. And as he stepped out of the forest, he knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: peace and the strength to move forward no matter what lay ahead.